Okay, Wes Huff is finally on Joe Rogan and it's making noise. There's a lot of people on both sides. Of course, I already expect skeptics to be critical. I already expect apologists to defend him, even if he's wrong. I've already noticed this. And at the end of the day, I want to give my take, but I also want to factor in Alex O'Connor's critique about what Wes gets wrong about the Bible. Before we do that, we need to lay out a little bit of chronology. Roughly 7 months ago, my friend Gnostic Informant, Neil, joined Danny Jones' massive podcast on YouTube, which gets a lot of attention. What did he join him on? Early Christianities, Gnostic Christianity. Did the early Christians see Yahweh as Satan? All sorts of special, juicy topics we like to cover here at MythVision, and the long ending of Mark. So roughly 7 months ago, when Neil gets this attention and joins this massive podcast, Talking Bible, it caught the attention of Wes Huff. Wes Huff, this up and coming, at the time, I would say maybe 30, 40,000 subscribers. I don't know exactly because it doesn't show you a timestamp of when people had as many subscribers. But around 7 months ago, Wes Huff was already doing hit pieces on Billy Carson, who appeared on Danny Jones, also Joe Rogan, who's in the vein of Danny Jones and watches this material. So Wes Huff was already fishing for attention to try and gain some credibility, notoriety, and popularity. Who doesn't want attention? I'm not knocking him for that at all. He's on a grind. It's his followers who are hypocrites, who act like me and Neil shouldn't be possibly wading into this and critiquing their hero. I would even go so far as say their new Messiah, because this guy can do no wrong. Well, he definitely did some wrong, because 7 months ago, he did a video critiquing Gnostic Informant Neil Sinlack, and in doing so, on Danny Jones' podcast, he erroneously tries to correct Neil and makes so many mistakes that me and Neil think this guy's probably lying. He's purposely making stuff up so his audience doesn't fall trap or possibly have doubt, or who knows what the reason is. We're seeing this because he made so many issues about Neil's point about the long ending of Mark, and then he made so many errors about Christmas, acting like he had studied this. And look, I came into this thinking maybe they did borrow from the pagans, but all the evidence came back, and it shows that actually, if anything, the pagans borrowed from Christianity. Wouldn't you know it? So Neil and me did a critique video, and in this video, I asked Neil a very important question.
My reply, correcting him on what I said, he never responded to me. He's never acknowledged that I even responded to him. That doesn't benefit him.
Will you debate him?
Absolutely, and he won't.
Okay.
And I'm calling him out right now. I'm willing to debate you on this topic.
Any day, anytime.
Anytime. And I think you're scared. That's why. He's going to say I'm booked till 2029.
He told me he was booked
even though he can jump and do a Billy Carson debate on the spot.
Right.
But not me.
I think you're scared.
We did the video, Wes Huff is lying like they accused Billy Carson, roughly 2 weeks ago, December the 26th. When we did that, Wes caught the attention of this, and many of his followers, like zombies, came into my chat, literally acting like, Wes didn't do anything wrong, Wes isn't wrong, you're wrong, and you're just dishonest, and da-da-da-da-da. Wes admitted this much to his very close friend Stephen Boyce, who's also a Christian apologist, and he joined me and Neil to talk about the long ending of Mark and such, but he brought the message. Look, Wes took down the video, doesn't want any problems, he made a mistake, he admit these mistakes. Is his followers going to listen? Wes is not perfect, we all know this, but his followers act like he can't get things wrong or he isn't wrong about things, and he clearly is, which I'm going to cover some of these things that I think aren't factored in and need to be in this video. Well, once we did that hit piece, if you will, back, because we didn't initiate it, Wes Huff took that video down, and then in that response you heard Neil thinking he's scared, Wes says this.
Let me just quickly say something here. I don't consider myself a debater. I'm not looking to become a professional debater. Have I done formal debates in the past? Yes. Will I do them in the future? Probably, but I am not obligated to agree to every debate challenge that comes across my desk, especially right now amidst the craziness that's currently taking place in my life. And I'm not running scared of you because I say no to your debate offer.
I think you're scared.
It's kind of ironic because some of his Christian apologist friends who were in the mix of seeing all this happen recognize that Wes's statement here really only publicly applied to Neil. Neil made a literal challenge to Wes and his followers. Just, why don't you have him on? I don't think you realize I've reached out. I've tried to make this attempt to reach to Wes to have him have a conversation. Neil made this point. Then he follows up with a video about not wanting debate. So when guys like Ruslan in the apologetic communities are spreading this, I would say, misinformation about their hero, their new Heracles, Wes Huff, and acting like, why don't you guys all debate like Wes Huff? You don't realize Wes Huff himself is backing out of this.
Gentlemen, is unfortunately he refuses to debate anyone. He has no time for debates because he's an academic Mormon. He's an academic Mormon. He refuses to debate anybody. Wes is pulling up with less than 24 hours and debating the Billy Carsons. We can't get this dude to debate anybody. And many people have went back and forth with him. Inspiring Philosophy has went back and forth with him and poked at some of the ridiculous notions that he's made. He refuses to sit down and actually debate anybody, which to me goes, well, if you're this brilliant and this much of an, maybe you should actually get in a lion's den and have your ideas challenged.
Just one of them.
Just one of them.
Yeah.
Just one of them. Nope, he refuses to debate people.
Truth be told, I'm not a debater either, just like Wes Huff said. Now, he might engage in debates. For me, most of it is sophistry and rhetoric. It's not about the truth. The best examples I can give of a debate is a response critique where you can thoroughly think through your argument and actually present your case rather than hip fire what do words do on the spot. You're just trying to stump your other dude and make him look like he lost. It's like a competition or a game. That is the way I look at debates. It's not about the facts and the evidence, and I prefer to chew on information rather than playing word games. This is what happens. There is a culture among Christians, and I would say Muslim apologists as well. Many atheists do this as well, where they debate and they're always going at it. It's not my personal style, just like it may not be Dan McClellan's or other people as well. But I will say this, Ruslan, since you're wanting this debate to be a case, if you're interested in having your dude debate, I got a guy right now I can call. My buddy Justin from Deconstruction Zone. I guarantee you at the drop of a hat, or Neil from Gnostic Informant, drop of the hat, these guys are happy to debate. They're happy to. Personally, I'm not into debating. I'm just not interested in these word sword fights, but they will. And I'm not so sure your guy would want to do that. Or maybe Alex O'Connor himself will end up challenging or debating Wes Huff. I don't think Wes is wanting to do that either. I don't need to rehash all this, but to say he admitted he made mistakes. He didn't make an apology video, of course. He just took down the video, and all of his fans who did not see the original video just think we're trying to ride Wes's wave here. Everybody's riding the wave, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, Wes started the whole wave riding thing by riding on Billy's. And of course, Billy probably rode other waves, and the list goes on and on in terms of who's riding waves. Well, I want to chime in as someone who has interviewed hundreds of different academics who has been very critical in assessing New Testament, assessing early Christianity, trying to understand the literary aspect of this, and how do we place this material in the context. At the same time, I want to give kudos to Alex O'Connor for such a cool critique. I want to add my own flavor in while we review what he says and some of the details that I imagine some of our scholar friends, like maybe Kip Davis, will add his 2 cents about what's going on between the great Isaiah scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the later Masoretic text of Isaiah.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic Text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic Text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text. That is the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1, that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version.
Awesome. Alex caught something quite interesting, that half of verse 9 and verse 10 are missing in the Great Isaiah Scroll, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's there in the Masoretic Text. But here's the deal. I just went ahead and got the book. I figured I'd show you straight up where we're at. The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, HarperCollins eBooks, Martin G. Abegg and Peter Flint, right? The Dead Sea Scroll. They translated the Dead Sea Scrolls so everybody can watch and see exactly what's going on here, where this is at. So we're going to go down here to the great prophet, one of the great prophets, Isaiah, and he goes in a little bit of the context here. But here's the first. Some variant readings are major in that they involve one or more verses present in some text, but absent from others. A contrasting pair of examples can be seen in chapter 2. This is the exact example Alex gives. On the one hand, the second half of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are not in 1Q Isaiah. These were most likely added later, a later addition to the text of Isaiah by some unknown scribe. Though made early enough, right? So someone could try and critique what Alex said, though made early enough to be recorded in 4Q Isaiah B, right? A and B. Of course, in the Masoretic text later, and the Septuagint, which we would have this last part of verse 9 and verse 10 in these versions. And then it goes on the other hand, verse 22 was not yet in the Hebrew Bible translated by the Septuagint, but was inserted later into 1Q Isaiah A and the traditional Masoretic text. So anyway, the scholars point out exactly what he's saying, but among the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1Q Isaiah A and B, you do find these verses in those versions of Isaiah. So sometime along the tradition of these guys in Qumran that are writing these scripts or translating and literally passing along the scribal tradition of Isaiah, someone inserts this in that period, in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Septuagint, 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, but it appears there and, of course, finds its way into the Masoretic text. So it isn't in the Great Isaiah Scroll, as Wes is saying word for word. We have a problem too, though. Wes's language for word, he literally says like it's exactly the same word for word.
Was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
It's
word
literally
word for word.
Almost word for word from the Enuma Elish.
Billy Carson, in his debate, he uses even softer, more nuanced language than that when comparing Genesis to the Enuma Elish and earlier Mesopotamian mythology. Let's hear what he says.
That's fair enough. I can respect that. So let's go into the Old Testament a little bit. Predominantly, from my research, I discovered that a lot of information from the Enuma Elish and the 7 tablets of creation is a lot of in Genesis, a lot of the creation story that comes into Genesis. Not all of it, but because obviously Genesis is a much smaller version of a much bigger story. But it's literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish and the 7 tablets of creation. The Epic of Atrahasis as well is also there in the Old Testament.
It's literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish.
Now, what's interesting is we can give benefit of the doubt to either party.
It's literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish.
Was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
If we're actually being fair and not trying to destroy people's lives like they are with Billy Carson. And that is what has happened. I mean, you posted the video anyway. It was clear he didn't want you to put it up, but you did. And of course, you won this debate and you've made him look like he's a sore loser online. Well, truth is, you notice how he said literally almost word for word. He doesn't say word for word. He says like almost word for word.
It's literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish.
Now, whether or not that's true or not, when I spoke to Billy and Dr. Joshua Bowen, an Assyriologist and Hebrew Bible scholar, also talked to Billy, he said, look, I'm saying it's clearly in some way influenced by this earlier Mesopotamian mythology. And some scholars actually think there is dependence on the Enuma Elish in Genesis. Scholars, not lay people like me who research and learn from scholars, but actual scholars who actually say they think Genesis may be dependent. Others don't. Joel Baden says, I don't think it's dependent, but they'll add the words like, Genesis wouldn't have existed if the Enuma Elish was never written. So there's this really nuanced perspective, like a gradient scale from 1 to 10. Somewhere in that region, you'll find scholars find dependence or in some way influencing of the Genesis myth from Epic of Gilgamesh, Enuma Elish, Eridu Genesis, and the various mythologies. So while there's this 1,000 years between the medieval Masoretic text that we have and the Dead Sea Scrolls, this 1,000-year period, Wes gives the impression to Joe Rogan that there's identical word for word. It's the same. And Joe's like, whoa. I mean, look, we get minor mistakes. That kind of stuff can happen, or even wording about things that are general. But when Joe takes this as a miracle and acts like this is impossible.
Was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle. That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Which is an odd thing for me, because if you look at Islam, for those Christians who deny Muhammad and the Quran, very early on, once they have it codified, you have Uthmanic preservation of the Quran, and obviously any variants or anything like that are burned and removed and gone. You have like a standard Quran that's being passed on for practically 1,400 years to modern day. And like they don't look at that and go, wow, what a miracle that scribes would have preserved as early as possible Quran as we know it. By the way, if you're wondering where the Arabian scribes, those writing in Arabic, preserving the Quran, get this idea of preserving their text and stuff, it's very likely that Jewish and Christian scribal traditions influenced them. So there is no miracle that someone's going to copy this stuff. But when you are giving the impression that word for word, they are identical.
Was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text?
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow. This is a big, deceitful claim that millions of people on Joe Rogan's podcast are going to see. So whether or not you're lying or not for Jesus, you're going to get the people to be persuaded of this, like, whoa, what a miraculous thing. Now, one could argue, well, I mean, theologically, it's practically identical to the earlier version. Okay, if that's what you would have said, then cool. The meaning of it overall didn't change. You didn't say that. And you didn't grant the same kind of mercy to Billy Carson when he was like, it's literally almost word for word to these earlier mythologies, even though scholars do recognize that Genesis is a polemic in some way, in Genesis 1 through 11 is arguing against the Mesopotamian background of mythology, right? Which means it knows of the material and is working within that genre in order to write its narrative, going from Adam to the Tower of Babel up to Abraham. Now let's look at Isaiah 53 verse 11, just to give you one example, because with those kind of literal terms that Wes brings up, as already was brought up by Alex O'Connor, into verse 9 and verse 10 are missing in the Great Isaiah Scroll. You can find fragments where it is in Qumran, but not in this scroll that is the complete copy of Isaiah that we have, that is also identically word for word what we find later. In verse 11, it says, out of the suffering of his soul, he will see light and find satisfaction. And through his knowledge, his servant, the righteous one, will make many righteous, and he will bear their iniquities. So looking at Isaiah 53 verse 11 in the New American Standard Bible, which is using the Masoretic in this situation here, sometimes this version, New American Standard, will use the Septuagint. In this case, it's working off the Masoretic right here in particular. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. Notice here, he will see light and find satisfaction, right? By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many. Well, the details here about seeing light and just he will see it aren't there. They're not in the Masoretic. You can find these little differences. They aren't word for word. So this idea wouldn't be a problem if all he was conveying is they pretty much generally say the same kinds of things, even though the Great Isaiah Scroll, scholars notice, is it seems to have an apocalyptic fervor that the Qumran sect would have had more so than the polished version of the Masoretic text later, because they were more imminent in apocalypticism during that period than they were later in the medieval period. At the same time, this wouldn't be a problem, I think, if Joe Rogan wasn't so dumbfounded by it and blown away and acting like it's a miracle, and now millions of people are literally believing what you're saying is fact, when it isn't fact.
Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. Well over 2,600.
Since the initial recording of this with Alex, much more news has come out about this 2,600 variants, and it's worse for Wes than how Alex even painted it. But you're going to have to stay tuned because Dr. Kip Davis is going to be bringing in that evidence. And I know that there was already a video done by Dan McClellan explaining some of this. The details will be in Kip Davis's video.
Again, many of these variants are minor, but Wes Huff told Joe Rogan that the scroll is word for word identical with the Masoretic text.
It was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Which is simply not true.
Bottom line is, I noticed once Alex did this, how many Christians came out of the woodworks and literally defended Wes, no matter what. Again, showing this tribal kind of, it isn't about facts. Like Christians, Wes was wrong here. Can we say this together? Wes was wrong here. It's that simple. The problem is there's so much tribalistic thought that comes into this that it's no matter what, Wes has got to be right. He's defending your worldview. So by hook or crook, we've got to be right. We can't let him be embarrassed by these Alex O'Connors, these MythVisions, these Gnostic informants, and these other critical thinkers online. Let's not have that happen. That can't go down. We have to fight and defend our dude. I know, I think Ruslan did a video defending him. There's several Christian apologists who went on defending him, immediately triggered by what Alex is saying in this video.
Was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle. That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have.
So before he moves on, I do want to emphasize that Joe should look into, if he's so blown away, he should look into other scribal traditions, including the Quran. If this is such a miracle, then he might be blown away by Islam. Okay. And this is actually one of the things when you deal with Muslim apologists, when they're defending the Quran, of course, its poetic nature, its beauty, and that no one can reconstruct a better book and things like that. Like, they are die hard about their text, their book. But fact is, just like Alex pointed out, and of course the Dead Sea Scroll scholars that I imagine are going to be following up, critiquing some of the stuff here Wes says, there are variants, there are discrepancies, and you can find some of these even in like a letter off in Arabic versions of the Quran later and stuff. There are these minor issues. It does nothing to the context. I feel like all of this can be a distraction from what the actual texts are saying, what they imply, what the actual teachings in these books say, and why they shouldn't be believed unless you're going to believe all these others and stuff. So there's much more to get into.
This Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea, he's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself. And then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead. We're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years. because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like there's something different that goes on there.
Oh, wow. There's something different that goes on there. Well, of course, like any good fundamentalist, anything the Bible says is what he believes. And he reads these narratives in such a manner that as it speaks through the text, he thinks that's what actually happened. So when Jesus says, I'm going to go and they're going to kill me, well, then he actually is going to go and kill him. And what's interesting where I'm at today, because I used to be like Wes and believe everything these texts said verbatim as they say them. Now I can actually be a lot more nuanced and hypothesize with various possibilities. I even have Dr. Jeffrey Tripp right now. He's writing an article on death by cop kind of persuasion. Is this a possibility that Jesus himself actually was going to get himself killed on purpose? If you read the letter to the Romans by Ignatius, in the chapter titles, he's like, please, I pray that you don't interrupt what I've got going on. I pray that I attain to God, to martyrdom. I want to die. Please allow me to go to my death. I want to become food for the belly of the beast. Let them grind me in the stomach. Like, it's pretty grotesque, but like he even says at one point in his letter to the Romans that if they won't kill me, I will entice them to do so. I will make them do it. So if you take this martyrology kind of concept, because it sounds selfless, but there is a glorious reward and trophy in the minds of the cult and in memory, and of course in reward to heaven, if you become a martyr. So it's like the most selfless thing you can do. Is Jesus, like the Maccabees, purposefully laying down his life in a way and choosing to die with some idea that if he does so, he'll cause the apocalypse, the end to happen, and that God's angels will come in? Is he purposely death by copying himself? This is a hypothesis. Other scholars think, no, he didn't actually predict his own death and had no intention of dying. Maybe thought God was going to come and save the day before he gets captured and killed by the Romans, which left the apostles dumbfounded and shocked and not realizing, how did this happen? We didn't think this was going to happen. But cognitive dissonance set in and allowed them to reconstruct in their mind, no, this was all part of the plan. And they searched the scriptures and they meditated and found passages that they midrashed Jesus into by saying, oh, he was supposed to be wounded for our transgressions and he was supposed to be killed. He's supposed to suffer all of these interesting things. The fun part where I'm at is I don't need to have some dogma and have to have one position to be true. He thinks that this is what made Christianity take over the whole Roman Empire. And yet, while it gradually grew, Alex O'Connor continues to point out, at the same pace that you see Mormonism grew. Now, I always think about this. People don't realize that Joseph Smith actually ran for United States president. Imagine if Joseph Smith would have actually won the presidency. Would America have become a Mormon country? Would that have made Mormonism more true? I'm asking you Christians who aren't Mormons. Would you have been, I must believe this now. Look at how many people believe what we believe. It's the same question you could spin off to Islam. Does it make Islam more true to you Christians that so many Muslims are Muslim in the world? There's so many people who believe in Islam? Not me, not in the slightest, because humans believe. Humans are susceptible to believe in systems and religions and thoughts like this. It does nothing to move the needle in my mind. But all of this is like cumulatively building up for Wes to think, whoa. And the fact that he brings up Jesus dying and rising as if it's a shocker, this doesn't happen normally, right? I agree it's not a normal thing, but it isn't unique. It's not like he's the only guy who dies and is resurrected or deified or even made metamorphosized into a god. Now, did he run around and claim to be God? No, he did not run around and claim to be God. Was he divine, though? Yes, I think he was divine as early as Paul. He literally, by his death, was made name above every name, Philippians 2 him. He was made into a deity. This is something the Greco-Roman world had ubiquitous. It was the oxygen that they breathed. It would be the same way of saying, was Dionysus God? You could say, yeah, but he wasn't God. He was a god. He was a son of a god, a demigod, son of Zeus. Well, Jesus was a demigod. He was a son of a god. This is where the birth narratives come in Matthew and Luke. And those don't agree with each other. And we're not going to go into all those discrepancies today. I literally just did a video showing you reasons why that those accounts don't agree with each other. There's so many factors that Wes leaves out that could be shown and revealed to people on Joe Rogan's podcast. It would be an excellent educational point. I'd love to volunteer and join Joe to explain some of these things and to go into the primary sources with him to show him other miracle stories, other deified men that were born miraculously.
Anyway, Wes also mentioned how it was amazing that the early church grew from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. On this, the sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible. By the way, we actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events. We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus, which we're about to get onto. But I just thought it was worth a mention.
It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.
Okay. So there's a lot there. The fact is, Wes is not a dummy. You can tell that he is very clever in the way that he is communicating with Joe to get Joe on the same page with him. The way his rhetoric is, he's proper with it. And he's saying, look, you and I have already established we both think the world is crazy. There's crazy things going on. Opening up the door for miraculous, opening up the door for his claims. And then he now wants to shift into these Gospels were written in the lifetime of these eyewitnesses. You hear him kind of do that. And Joe's going, yeah, I do think there's crazy stuff going on, right? Okay, I think the world's crazy. I think reality is pretty crazy. But even though I don't draw the miraculous approach they do, let's hear what Wes continues to say.
And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay.
All right, so fact-checking these eyewitness claims, let's cover a few things. I brought some notes, and this is stuff that doesn't get addressed by Alex, so I'm hoping to bring some fresh information here that might allow us to dive deeper. Before we get to eyewitnesses, let's first address this general idea. If we're opening up the door, crazy things happen. We don't believe that, we believe more than matter and motion and all this kind of stuff that he's doing with Joe. Let's talk about why don't we accept these demigods? Some are fictional, some are historical people, and they were all sired by Zeus, Jupiter. Achilles, Aeolus, Alexander, Amphion, Argus, Atimnus, Castor, Corinthus. That's the founder of Corinth, by the way. The literal city was named after this guy. Chronacus, Dardanus, and Mathyon. The list goes on and on, right? Macedon, we can go to Minos, Perseus, Pollux, and of course, Zethus, right? These are all Zeus. Why don't we also check out the list by Apollo? Mind you, these are gods that are impregnating mortal women. They have mortal mothers just like Jesus. Why aren't we accepting these guys and taking serious their views? I would argue we're not indoctrinated to believe in these particular gods and their views. That is all it is the system of indoctrination that I think is causing us to not take these serious. Asclepius, right? We've got all of these in alphabetical order. This is in Richard C. Miller's book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. Richard C. Miller. Various other gods too, right? These are just a short list. There are several other gods, demigods, heroes that were birthed by Apollo and Zeus, right? I just wanted to show you those few. Again, in that list that you saw, there were several figures that made real historical impact, like Alexander the Great. This guy was so significant. He literally made world-changing things happen in his own life. Not claims of things, gets killed, and then his followers start spreading words, and then those words and stories spread, and then eventually down the road, they make an impact in the real world. We're talking historical, on-the-spot, significant changes, just like Vespasian, which we're going to get to about his miracles, and eyewitnesses who saw it, and it's verified by multiple attestation and accounts, yet those get dismissed, do not get taken serious, or are not believed by the Christians. Now, why is that? Because they have a tunnel vision and indoctrination in their particular worldview. I want to talk about the god Asclepius. Church fathers sometimes would refer to as Antichrist. This god did so many miracles and was so well known and believed universally, worshipped universally, that he covered everything, every ailment, every sickness, everything. This god, 4 centuries prior to Jesus's period in the 1st century, so 4th century BCE, at Epidaurus in the Greco-Roman world, this god was healing people left and right at his temples. His temples were all over, but this one place had stone stelae that actually inscribed the miracles of the devotees that came to that temple to find healing. And I would like to get into a few of these. Some of them are similar in nature to what we find in the Gospels with Jesus's healings, but also just generally how this God performed these kind of miracles. And I also want to mention we have 4 of these stelae, right? 4 of them. Pausanias mentions that there were like 10 to 12. And just on these 4, we have 70 miracles attested that this God performed on people. 70. Which means if 4 has 70 and there's 12, meaning 8 more, you could just do 70 plus 70, right? 140. There's 140 miracles that we don't have, that we've lost to history, just at this particular temple that were on the walls inside the God's temple for devotees who came for healing. That's pretty significant. We have ancient attestation 400 years prior to Jesus where they are depicting and inscribing the miracles of this God. Let's read one that's similar to Doubting Thomas. A man who was paralyzed in all his fingers except one came as a suppliant to the god. While looking at the plaques in the sanctuary, he doubted the cures and spoke disparagingly about the inscriptions. During his sleep at the sanctuary, he had a vision. In the dream, it seemed he was playing knuckle bones below the temple. As he was about to throw them, the god appeared, sprang onto his hand, and stretched out his fingers. The man then seemed to bend and stretch each finger one by one. Once he had straightened them all, the god asked him if he still doubted the inscriptions on the plaques. The man replied, "No." The god then said, "Because you doubted them before, though, they were not unbelievable. From now on, your name shall be Unbeliever." When day came, the man left fully healed. Sounds kind of like Doubting Thomas in the Gospels, does it not? Blessed are those who don't see and yet still believe, Thomas. You believe because you saw. Well, this guy had to have this experience to become a believer. How about a man with a missing eyeball? A man once came to the god as a supplicant, blind in one eye. though he still had the eyelids of that eye. The socket was completely empty, with no trace of an eyeball inside. Some of the people in the sanctuary laughed at his simple-mindedness, thinking it absurd that he believed he could regain sight with nothing more than an empty eye socket. During his sleep, a vision of the god appeared to him. In the vision, the god prepared a drug, pulled apart the man's eyelids, and poured the drug into the empty socket. When day came, the man departed with sight in both eyes. Or this blind man, Anticrates of Knidos, had been struck through both eyes with a spear during a battle, leaving him blind. The spearhead remained lodged in his face, which he carried with him. While sleeping in the sanctuary, he had a vision in which the god appeared, removed the spearhead, and restored his eyes, fitting his pupils back into his eyelids. When day came, he left fully healed. The spearhead that was removed by the god from a man's jaw. Euthyphros had a spearhead lodged in his jaw for 6 years. While he was sleeping in the sanctuary, the god appeared in a vision, removed the spearhead from his jaw, and placed it in his hands. When day came, Euthyphros walked out fully healed, holding the spearhead in his hands. We have a paralyzed man healed. Hermatikos of Lampsacus, paralyzed in body, came to the sanctuary. While he was sleeping here, he was healed. Upon waking, he was instructed to carry the largest stone he could find into the sanctuary. He brought the stone that now lies in front of the Abaton. Blind man first sees trees after being healed by the God man. Listen to this. Alcetus of Helias, I'm probably butchering these names, who was blind, had a dream while sleeping in the sanctuary. In the dream, it seemed the god approached him and opened his eyes with his fingers. The first thing he saw was the trees in the sanctuary. When day came, he left fully healed. Now read Mark 8:22-25. Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. Asclepius touched the other guy. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Notice how similar those are. Maybe have no connection. Maybe, because Asclepius was a god that was so significant, and these stories about his miracles were still being passed on and believed down into the time of Celsus, the critic of Christianity, Pausanias, the geographer who traveled and saw these inscriptions, not just the 4 stelae we have, but he actually saw all of the other ones as well. Like, he knew how prevalent Asclepius was all around the Greco-Roman world, which the region where Jesus is part of that world. I also want to bring up another account that is important coming from Celsus in against Celsus from Origen. This is pertaining to Asclepius. And again, when it is said of Asclepius that a great multitude of both Greeks and barbarians acknowledge that they have frequently seen and still see no mere phantom, but Asclepius himself healing and doing good and foretelling the future, Celsus requires us to believe this and finds no fault with the believers in Jesus. When we express our belief in such stories, but when we give our assent to the disciples and eyewitnesses of the miracles of Jesus, who clearly manifest the honesty of their convictions because we see their guilelessness as far as it is possible to see the conscious revealed in writing, we are called by him a set of silly individuals. Although he cannot demonstrate that an incalculable number, as he asserts, of Greeks and barbarians acknowledge the existence of Asclepius, while we, if we deem this a matter of importance, can clearly show a countless multitude of Greeks and barbarians who acknowledge the existence of Jesus. And some give evidence of their having received through this faith a marvelous power by the cures which they perform, revoking no other name over those who need their help than that of God of all things and of Jesus, along with the mention of his history. For by these means we too have seen many persons freed from grievous calamities and from distractions of mind and madness and countless other ills, which could be cured neither by men or devils. Nor devils. Again, he's making an argument against Celsus. Show me all these barbarians and Greeks. And the interesting thing is, this seems like a deceptive thing that Origen would say, unless he hasn't actually read these inscriptions and known how prevalent Asclepius was as a god healing people worldwide at the time. It's just so ironic. It's like the argument when a Christian says that you have no morality and all your morality is borrowed from the Christians, not realizing how much the Christians themselves, in the original documents we find in the New Testament, are influenced by the Platonic, Stoic philosophies of their day. If you do not know the Greek, Roman, earlier philosophical schools, how they impacted Jewish thought and how this impacted Christian thought, you have no clue about these moral standards. You just don't have, you have not been honestly educating yourself on understanding where these morals come from, where these ideas of assenting to the good comes from. Again, when we read Justin Martyr comparing Jesus and other demigods and sons of Zeus and virgin births and stuff that he talks about, he's not arguing on an ontological level like these are myths and didn't happen and ours did. He's saying ours is true because our guy is good. Philosophy is the point. The better person is the more true, and that's the more godly, and therefore the most this is the most trustworthy account. That's the problem. So like we're now looking at this guy who's writing against Celsus almost a century after he writes his critique of Christianity, misidentifies him as an Epicurean when he's actually a Platonic thinker. This is a big problem. We really have to look back, but realize, oh my gosh, there's competing miraculous claims for Asclepius and Jesus at the time. We only have the writings that exist from a Christian who's defending his own worldview. I want to shift into Asclepius raising people from the dead from some of these sources. You can find these sources in Wendy Cotter's book, Miracles in Greco-Roman Antiquity, a source book for the study of New Testament miracle stories. In this book, holy smokes, there's so much material that actually covers miracles and such in the context of early Christianity that would have been influential for the gospel authors to have been inspired by, or people in general would have heard and known of their day. So what in the section she goes over, raises the dead, Asclepius literally is said to have raised people from the dead and gets in trouble for it. He raises so many people from the dead that Hades is pissed and Zeus has to do something about it. So he ends up killing Asclepius by thunderbolt. So let's go into a few of these sources here, right? Hippocrates says, let your ancestor Asclepius be a warning to you in that he was requited with a thunderbolt for saving humankind. You mean a demigod, son of God, was punished for saving humankind? That's interesting. You also get this idea from Prometheus as well, where he is trying to save humankind and Zeus punishes him by pretty much chaining him to a rock, like almost like he's being crucified, if you will, to a rock. And each day an eagle, I believe, comes and eats his liver and he's tortured forever and ever. In one of the stories, Heracles comes and frees him. Diodorus Siculus, who wrote in 60 to 30 BCE, this is before Jesus is on the scene. Right there in this pivot, though, where the Gospels and New Testament era is going to happen within the next century, right? So 100 to 110 years from now, you get Gospels being written. Asclepius is slain by Zeus at the complaint from Hades about diminishing numbers of dead because of the healing gods saving them. Listen to this. Diodorus Siculus, Library of History, 471, 1-3. Asclepius was the son of Apollo and Cronius. And since he excelled in natural ability and sagacity of mind, he devoted himself to the science of healings and made many discoveries which contribute to the health of humankind. And so far did he advance along the road of fame that to the amazement of all, he healed many sick whose lives had been despaired of. And for this reason, it was believed that he had brought back to life many who had died consequently. The myth goes on to say, Hades brought accusation against Asclepius, charging him before Zeus of acting to the detriment of his own province. For, he said, the number of the dead was steadily diminishing now that men were being healed by Asclepius. So Zeus, in his indignation, slew Asclepius with his thunderbolt. But Apollo, indignant at the slaying of Asclepius, murdered the Cyclopes who had forged the thunderbolt for Zeus. But at the death of the Cyclopes, Zeus was again indignant and laid a command upon Apollo that he should serve as a laborer for a human being, and that this should be the punishment he should receive from him for his crimes. Again, here is a father god killing or punishing a son of a god for saving humanity. Now, Christians will quickly go, Jesus died for our sins. The Father's wrath and hate and anger, justice towards sin literally gets punished on a son of God who's born by a god and a mortal woman, like all of these other demigods. But you don't accept those. Let's go to Virgil now. The father of omnipotent hurled down to Stygian waters, the finder of such healing craft. Virgil's Aeneid 765 to 773. For they tell how that Hippolytus, when he fell by his Stedamame's craft and slaked a sire's vengeance in blood, torn asunder by frightened steeds, came again to the starry firmament and heaven's upper air, recalled by the healer's herbs and Diana's love, then the Father omnipotent, wroth that any mortal should rise from the nether shades to the light of life, resurrection, being raised again from the dead, himself with his thunder hurled down to the Stygian waters, the finder of such healing craft, the Phobos born, Apollo born. So it's poetic, it's Virgil's style, but it's recounting the same thing of him healing people, raising them from the dead, and yet the Father, the Heavenly Father, the omnipotent Father, ends up thunderbolting him and killing him. Apollodorus, writing in the 1st century CE, Asclepius raised 6 men, Capanius, Lycurgus, Hippolytus, Tyndarus, Hymenaeus, and Glaucus. So in Apollodorus, the library 310, 3-4, I found some who are reported to have been raised by him, to wit, Capanius and Lycurgus, as Stesichorus, 645 to 555 BCE, says. In the Ariphile, Hippolytus, as the author of the Grammatica, 6th century BCE, reports. Tyndarus, as Paneas, circa 500 BCE, says. Hymenaeus, as the Orphics report, and Glaucus, son of Minos, as Melasagoras, 5th century BCE, relates. But Zeus, fearing that men might acquire the healing art from him, so he's afraid he's going to give this art to others, and so come to the rescue of each other, smote him with a thunderbolt. So this Apollodorus says he had to get rid of him, because if not, he's going to teach others this art of resurrecting people from the dead and keeping them from dying and going to Hades. Really probably changing the order of creation, right? There's that idea too. You're supposed to die. You're not immortal unless you're made immortal. Philodemus, circa 1st century CE. This is the same period around this time that the Gospels are being written. Zeus struck Asclepius by lightning because according to the writer of the Grammatica, 6th century BCE, and the Asclepius of Talistes, 4th century BCE, and the like-named work of the lyric poet Synesius, 4th century BCE, he raised Hippolytus from the dead at the instance of Artemis, but according to the Ariphile of Cessatorus, circa 640 to 555 BCE, it was because he raised Capanius and Lycurgus. So you have differing accounts. Kind of like you have Gospels that have different accounts as well. Pliny the Elder, Asclepius was killed for raising Tyndarus to life. Lucian, Zeus was angry with Asclepius over the resurrection of Tyndarus. Zeus must stop the quarreling between Hercules. Oh, this is so fun. Lucian is amazing. There's just like debate and argument between Zeus and Hercules of who should be above the other. And Asclepius dies before Heracles, so he's his better. And Zeus has to get in between and says, stop, quit the crap. Sextus Empiricus, he's another one. Again, raising the dead. So many accounts describe him raising the dead. It's not even funny. So this is obviously not a well-known or understood thing, as Wes says, and that's ridiculous and is an outright dishonest lie or an ignorant statement. And if I give him the benefit of the doubt, he's just ignorant on it. And now millions of people are thinking this is true. That's not true. Pausanias echoes the same. He also echoes those stelae that we've been talking about in the miracles from. So then there's also Isis, the foreign deity Isis, who she heals diseases. She literally raises people from the dead. She raises the dead. In this one, right? Diodorus Siculus, we read him earlier, says, furthermore, she discovered also the drug which gives immortality, by means of which she not only raised from the dead her son Horus, who had been object of plots on the part of the Titans and had been found dead under the water, giving him his soul again, but also made him immortal. And it appears that Horus was the least of the gods to be king after his father Osiris departed from among men. Wow. Here's another one, right? It goes into more. But she heals people from the dead. Let's move on into heroes who heal, because this is going to get into some juicy stuff. Again, we're dealing with contemporaneous stuff. Pythagoras, the school of Plato, Pythagoras, and even the Christians, they wrestled for centuries over whose school of philosophy is more accurate and true. Okay. And this gets into Apollonius of Tyana, who is in the Pythagorean school. Porphyry mentions Pythagoras about pestilence. He chases away pestilence. Pythagoras prepared songs for the diseases of the body. So he cured the sick. So Imblicus, we have Pythagoras is said to be responsible for the rapid expulsions of pestilences. Again, Empedocles, another philosopher, along with Pythagoras, heals diseases. So you have a woman from a month-long trance. All the suffering comes from the new god Empedocles. Come to the new god Empedocles, sorry. So he's healing these sufferings. He raises the dead. Listen to this. Empedocles saves the life of Panthea, who was given up by doctors. So Diogenes, Laertes, Empedocles, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, 869. Hermippus tells us that Empedocles cured Panthea, a woman of Agrigentum, who had been given up by the physicians. They hey, we can't help her. She's done. And this was why he was offering sacrifice, and that those invited were about 80 in number. So you have 80 members witnessing this philosopher Empedocles, who is healing a woman who even the physicians had given up. He heals the woman, raises her from the dead. Rulers who heal. You can go to the Greek king Papyrus of Epirus, and I'm sure there are several other accounts in the ancient world. She's just documenting several that are important around the time of Jesus. These are contemporaneous writings that are echoing these sources around the time the Gospels are being written. Century or two before, century or two after the Gospels, but in that area of that time. So again, he heals diseases. Roman emperors who heal. This is important. Augustus heals and pestilences of the world by his Pax Romana. Jesus is claiming to bring peace, but it's an internal peace that Christians experience usually. Unless you want to argue it took 2,000 years to find peace, but I still see shit happening in the world that isn't peaceful. Augustus brought actual peace, Pax Romana, for like 40-something years in the empire. This guy like legitimately brought some serious peace to the empire, okay? He, in their minds, was divine for this reason. It was obvious we're dealing with the divine man. Tacitus talks about Vespasian. This is an important one. He cures a blind man and a withered hand. Let's read it. Tacitus Histories 481. During the months while Vespasian was waiting at Alexandria for the regular season of the summer winds and a settled sea, many marvels occurred to mark the favor of heaven and a certain partiality of the gods toward him. One of the common people of Alexandria, well known for his loss of sight, threw himself before Vespasian's knees, praying him with groans to cure his blindness, being so directed by the god Serapis, whom this most superstitious of nations worships before all others. And he besought the emperor to deign to moisten his cheeks and eyes with his spittle, his spit. Jesus does the same thing. Another, whose hand was useless, prompted by the same god, begged Caesar to step and trample on it. Vespasian at first ridiculed these appeals and treated them with scorn. Then, when the men persisted, he began at one moment to fear the discredit of failure, at another to be inspired with hopes of success by the appeals of the suppliants and the flattery of his courtiers. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Finally, he directed the physicians to give their opinion whether such blindness and infirmity could be overcome by human aid. Their reply treated the two cases differently. They said that in the first, the case of the blind man, the power of sight had not been completely eaten away, and it would return if the obstacles were removed. In others, the useless hand, the joints had slipped and become displaced, but they could be restored if a healing pressure were applied to them. Such perhaps was the wish of the gods, and it might be that the emperor had been chosen for this divine service. In any case, if a cure were obtained, the glory would be Caesar's, but in the event of failure, ridicule would fall only on the poor supplicants. So Vespasian, believing that his good fortune was capable of anything and that nothing was any longer incredible, with a smiling countenance and amid intense excitement on the part of the bystanders, meaning people are eyewitnesses to this, did as he was asked to do. The hand was instantly restored. So he stepped on the person's hand and it was instantly restored. And the day again shone for the blind man. He spit in his hand and puts it in his eyes, just like Jesus. Both facts are told by eyewitnesses even now when falsehood brings no reward. So they could, like, he literally has eyewitnesses saying they saw this happen. And again, the next section in that says, these events, the healing of the blind man and the cure of the useless hand, gave Vespasian a deeper desire to visit the sanctuary of the god Serapis to consult with him with regard to his imperial fortune. He ordered all to be excluded from the temple. No one's in there. Then afterward, he had entered the temple and was absorbed in contemplation of the god. He saw behind him one of the leading men of Egypt named Basilides. I don't want to get weird or over parallel or anything like that about this early Christian that Clement of Alexandria talks about Basilides as this early Gnostic teacher who's also in Alexandria, Egypt. Basilides may just be a common name, but ironic that they have a similar name. Who he knew was detained by sickness in a place many days' journey distant from Alexandria. Isn't that odd? So he knows he's way, way away. How come he sees him in the temple? No one's in there right behind him. He asked the priest whether Basilides had entered the temple on that day. He questioned the passersby whether he had been seen in the city. Finally, he sent some cavalry and found that at that moment, he had been 80 miles away. Then he concluded that this was a supernatural vision and drew a prophecy from the name Basilides. Wow. There's so much more that we can get into. Vespasian, again, another account Suetonius talks about the same miracle he mentions. Suetonius talks about, Dio Cassius talks about this. And then we get into the itinerant philosopher of imperial times, Apollonius the Tyana, and it goes into him healing diseases. He heals a lame man and a blind man, cures a paralyzed hand. He helps a woman successfully give birth. He heals a boy bitten by a mad dog. We're just scrolling through. He raises the dead. I mean, this is powerful stuff. Put down the beer, for I will stay your tears. The physician Asclepiades of the 1st century BCE raises the dead as well. So this is another guy who's raising the dead. Fun stuff, huh? Really, really interesting. I thought was worth covering for you who may never have read any of this material. Maybe you just didn't know about it.
It gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus.
Alex O'Connor, you are literally saying the thing me and Neil have been saying all along. It ends with, go to Galilee where he said he would see you, but the women tell no one, for they were afraid. Meaning they didn't tell them. Now, I know we have Matthew, we have Luke, we have John. We have this existing tradition. What was Mark up to? This is the question. I don't need to have the dogma of Matthew, Luke, John to interpret Mark. I don't need the church to tell me Mark meant this. I don't need the Christians to tell me that's what Mark meant. Mark meant what I need him to say. What if he is saying that the women told no one? What kind of possible interpretations could we potentially come up with if Mark meant the women did not tell the 12? Therefore, they never actually met them in Galilee. What if? I'm just throwing out there because we don't need to follow any dogma. We can be open-minded to following different possibilities. And it's even possible, if you take someone like Dr. James D. Tabor's view, that there's a rift between the Pauline and the Jerusalem school, which would have been the apostles, which would have likely been destroyed almost to extinction, if not to extinction, in the war in 70 AD. So if the women did not go tell no one, they didn't tell them because they were afraid, the 12 didn't get the gist, but maybe one did. One named the Apostle Paul, born in an untimely manner. He got it. He had the gospel, and this is his understanding of how to follow Christ. I'm just throwing it out there. Many scholars do think Mark is working off of Paul's letters and is aware of Paul's theology. Could be. It's also possible that, yeah, it's implied that he's going to meet them in Galilee, but there is no physical appearance. He literally is taken up, which is a deification. His body missing, as we brought up Richard C. Miller's work. He has the translation fable tropes and shows in his gallery in chapter 2 countless examples of people that their bodies go missing. Looking at Richard C. Miller's translation sub-themes, you have stuff like heinous or ignoble injustice rectified by a translation. Jesus dies. It's not noble. The way he dies was an injustice. And he's translated. He becomes deified and taken to heaven. With a metamorphosis, he's vanished, missing body. By the way, this isn't just Jesus. He has an entire gallery of figures that all of these things in some way check off on some of the characters. So some of them get some of these checked. Some of them don't have these themes. But these are just 15 sub-themes. There may even be more. Dr. Miller's still saying much more can be done in this area to explore these tropes, these elements that we find all throughout the ancient Greco-Roman world. Alexander the Great. Source, here's the source. Fable, as the conqueror's premature death loomed close and he rested in Babylon, he conceived the idea that he should perhaps take his own life by throwing himself into the Euphrates River in order that his body having disappeared, he might be numbered among the gods, thus sustaining his divine myth that he was a demigod, son of Ammon Zeus. Notice the sub-themes: vanished, missing body, translation associated with a river, feigned translation. So the body goes missing, right? That is evidence that he is now numbered among the gods. If you don't know about the novel of Kalihari, either way, the lover comes to the tomb, an empty tomb where she is not in the tomb, and then realizes she's been taken by the gods. One of the gods is jealous of him, that he was married to her, and literally takes her up to heaven. So it is implied by the body missing post-death that they have become gods or they're goddesses, and they've been deified. But one of the interesting ones I wanted to get into was this character, Aristeas of Proconesus, that goes way, way back in the sources. There's a lot of them. Pindar, Herodotus, of course, Plutarch, Origen, and against Celsus, he argues this too. But originally, here's the fable. Originally an epicoric legendary tale of Proconesus and Sisyphus. I'm probably butchering these pronunciations. The translation fable of Aristeas was made famous by Pindar and Herodotus. The legend stated that this divine man and poet had entered a fuller's shop in Proconesus and there fell dead. The fuller then locked up his shop and went to notify the poet's relations. As the shopkeeper was out for quite some time, apparently days, with this task, a man reported to the town that as he was on the road from Artake to Cyzicus, he had just met Aristeas, something impossible were Aristeas to have just died, as the fuller had reported. The fuller and Aristeas' friends and family, therefore, returned to the fuller's shop only to find the body of Aristeas missing. 7 years later, as the tale states, Aristeas appeared again in Proconesus and wrote his famous Armaspia, and again vanished. Another 240 years later, the Metapontes of Italy reported that Aristeas appeared to them as well and instructed them to build an altar to Apollo in their land and erect an adjacent statue of himself. Then he again vanished. Subthemes: vanished missing body, post-mortem translation, post-translation speech, post-translation appearance, eponymous etiology. The list goes on and on. He's got Asclepius in here. They're alphabetical. There's like 79 examples of people whose bodies literally, not all their bodies go missing. Out of the 79, there's like 56 or 57 of them where the body goes missing. The same exact trope and theme we see in the Gospels that is found in all of these other translation fable accounts. We even find it in the Kalihari, the Kalorho story of that woman's body missing from the tomb, contemporaneous novel to the Gospel material. This is a well-established theme, a trope. But I want to point out something else as well as we continue in Alex's video about the doubting scenario that many of them doubted, because while Alex is pointing out that Mark does not have any actual appearances, the debate gets messy when they go, what kind of body then? Because the body is missing. Doesn't that mean he bodily rose? Let's not get distracted. Granted, who gives a shit? Yeah, his body rose. According to this story, in some way, shape, or form, the body's transformed. Got it. This is what Heracles and all these other characters are. When Heracles dies on the pyre, his bones are missing. The bones would not have burned in a pyre fire. Sorry for the rhyming, but his bones would have remained, but the bones are missing. The same is true of the Caesars. When they were burned, they would give wax effigies of the bodies, making it look like when they melted, there was no bones left. The body went missing. They would feign translation. Richard C. Miller pointed all this out. Eyewitnesses saw Roman emperors after they were dead on Roman roads, appearing to people. People swore on oath in court by law that he was alive. They saw him after he was dead, ascending to heaven. This stuff was so commonplace. I mean, if you don't think Christians were picking up these tricks, these authors of these texts were not picking up these tricks, the cults on the ground outside of the text were not modeling, mimicking, imitating through mimesis these other well-known and established narratives that constructed the Roman imperial cult, the mystery cults of the day of the Greco-Roman period. You're just purposefully being blind. You're being ignorant on purpose. You're not actually evaluating all the evidence. You're not considering everything there is to see. You're not realizing, even looking internally, which Alex does a damn good job of doing. Internally, there's incohesive. It's not perfectly coherent. There's contradictions. There's friction. There's development of the narratives. There's so much that Alex is touching on. In his way with words, he's so precise and very philosophically means what he says what he means, and doesn't have to do what I do, which is go on and explaining so much material. But he is just sticking with the New Testament, and there's so much to do there, let alone getting into all this stuff I'm trying to highlight, because most people don't know this, let alone the New Testament. And Alex is just sticking to New Testament.
Numerous and detailed post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus dates this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD. Wes Huff suggests an earlier dating based on an ancient fragment of the Gospel of John called P52. Here's what he says.
So you were talking about, like, what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52. John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. The reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. C.H. Roberts is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript. Wow. Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow. He correctly points out that there is dispute in the dating here. But notice that while Wes places P52 in the 2nd century,
it's comfortably 2nd century.
He pushes John's gospel itself at minimum and comfortably back into the 1st century.
Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably.
Why? Well, because of the time it would take after John wrote the gospel in Ephesus for it to travel to Egypt and be copied.
Written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript.
A few problems with this. First, Wes assumes that the 4th gospel really was written by John the Apostle in Ephesus. This is, to say the least, heavily contested by New Testament scholars. But even so, Egypt just isn't all that far away from Ephesus, reachable in a few weeks for an ancient traveler, maybe a bit longer. Originally, P52 was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD. Split the difference at 125. Even if this early dating is correct, that still gives us 25 years for the gospel to have traveled from Ephesus to Egypt and still have been written within the 2nd century. But of course, even this dating is disputed. In 2012, Professor of Early Christianity Brent Nongbri wrote a paper in the Harvard Theological Review dispelling this very use of P52 to date the Gospel of John, called The Use and Abuse of P52. Here's what he says. What I have done is to show that any serious consideration of the window of possible dates for P52 must include dates in the later 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Thus, P52 cannot be used as evidence to silence other debates about the existence or non-existence of the Gospel of John in the 1st half of the 2nd century. The John Rylands Library itself, the library in Manchester which holds P52, says that recent research points to a date nearer to 200 AD. This would give the Gospel a century to travel to Egypt and still have been written in the 2nd century. But Wes Huff thinks, based on his confidence that P52 is from the 2nd century, that we can, again, at minimum and comfortably place the Gospel of John in the 1st century. Once again, as with the Isaiah scroll, I think he's just speaking way too confidently. And to be clear, I'm not claiming that John was written.
Yeah, this is a fact. I mean, if you just turn right over to what Brent Nongbri actually wrote during this whole debacle that happened on Joe Rogan's podcast, he's an expert who's studied this. Variant readings, you can go to his website, brentnongbri.com. He writes on this. P52 on the Joe Rogan Experience, fact check. I'm not a regular consumer of the Joe Rogan Experience, but I was compelled to check it out when I heard that the podcaster was chatting about Papyri Riley. I'm not sure what the acronyms are here, aka P52. The small fragment of papyrus leaf containing a bit of chapter 18 of the Gospel according to John. The occasion was a conversation with a Christian apologist. And of course, scholarship, right? Here we go. The interview contained a number of standard apologetic talking points, so it is not surprising that the general topic of papyrology and the specific topic of P52 comes up, along with a facsimile and reconstruction of the leaf. I've studied this fragment pretty carefully over the years. Articles in Harvard Theological Review in 2005 and New Testament Studies in 2020. So I'm I'm fairly familiar with the scholarship. Unfortunately, the apologist makes a number of false or misleading claims. So for anyone who might be interested, here's a brief fact check. Discovered by C.H. Roberts in 1940s, false. The piece was among several chosen and bought for the Rylands Library by Bernard Grenfell in 1920. C.H. Roberts published the piece in 1935. The codex is almost exclusively a Christian convention. False. We have many codices that contain non-Christian material. Most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. Misleading. We don't really know where this piece came from because it was bought on the antiquities market and not scientifically excavated. It's possible it comes from Oxyrhynchus, but Grenfell was buying from dealers elsewhere in Egypt in addition to the area of Oxyrhynchus. There's still debate about the dating of this papyrus. That's true. There probably always will be, though. So, that's not a big one. The unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially beginning of the 2nd century, which means that it is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus, so it has to be written by John, spread around, and find its way to Egypt, copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably. Very much debatable, he says. This is the same story that was being told pretty much from the time of the publication of P52 in 1935. In older versions, the date of the papyrus was usually given as circa 125 AD. But here the rhetoric is a bit more slippery. Comfortably 2nd century, potentially beginning of the 2nd century. But for the logic to work, that potentially beginning of the 2nd century has to become definitely beginning of the 2nd century. But the dating of P52 is not at all certain. It is just based on handwriting analysis. And there are good parallels for the script of P52 in papyri from the late 2nd century and even the 3rd century, the 200s. See my 2020 New Testament studies piece. The fact is, we don't know the date of this piece with confidence, so trying to use P52 to establish a 1st century date for the composition of the gospel according to John doesn't work. I don't have a horse in the race when it comes to the time of the composition of John, but I would stand by the words I wrote back in 2005. P52 cannot be used as evidence to silence other debates about the existence or non-existence of the gospel of John in the first half of the 2nd century. Only a papyrus containing an explicit date or one found in a clear archaeological stratigraphic context would do the work scholars want P52 to do. As it stands now, the papyrological evidence should take a second place to other forms of evidence in addressing debates about the dating of the 4th gospel. The interview also has some misleading statements about P75, aka P. Bodmer 14-15, aka Hannah Papyrus 1. I've written a bit about the different scholarly views on this relationship and offered my own take on things, Journal of Biblical Literature 2016. It's good to see early Christian manuscripts being discussed in a popular setting, but it would be better, even better, if the information was accurate. I agree. So Wes actually shows up in the chat and kind of like defends himself, but like plays super nice to Brent. And Brent's just like, thanks for the comment. Non-linear conversation. Yes, I don't envy you having to shift basically mid-sentence from one Christian papyri to, hey, what do you think about the Voyic manuscript? If my comments in the past seem a little less than charitable, that arises from my frustration with the overall presentation of P52 as a kind of paradigm-shifting artifact. It can't bear this weight. And that's exactly what Wes did in the video when he said, I definitely don't agree with your assessment. I would not use that as a standalone argument if I was arguing in that direction. I completely agree that it is nothing close to a seal-the-deal rationale. My telling of the story, albeit inadequately, about Roberts and Bauer was to take the opportunity while Joe was talking about paradigm shifts and consensus changing. So they had a conversation. They went back and forth. Long story short, most people don't know about this exchange. And I don't even think at this moment Alex is making his video that he knew about it. But Brent actually is like, no, dude, you literally are smirking with Joe going, listen, this is safely early. And then by the time John wrote this, we don't even know, as Alex said, and he's not wrong. We do not know who wrote this Gospel of John. We are not sure that John the Apostle, the beloved apostle, that's a whole nother, the beloved disciple, a whole nother thing where academics have even thought this potentially is a fictional character put into the story of John, that it's not James and it's not John, son of Zebedee. It's not this guy. It's not this guy. Like, people made guesses. Early church fathers made guesses, but it may be a fictional trope to place this character in the story. He may be a fictional character. Why not just name him, right? And so there's been work done on this. I know that right now the Hermeneia commentary on John is being worked on, and the academic, I am having a hard time pulling the exact name up off my top of my head right here, but he's writing on this, and there's scholars out there that literally think that this is a fictional character. That character is fictional. So yeah, they do attribute later to this guy, John, but is that part of what happens in the myth making of their pedigree in the 2nd century? Maybe this guy named John did write it. Ladies and gentlemen, just in case you didn't believe me, I'm speaking to Dr. Hugo Mendez. He is an expert on the Gospel of John, and he is at Chapel Hill with Bart Ehrman. So, Dr. Mendez, if you will, is the beloved disciple likely a fictional trope or a fictional character in a story? And if you don't mind laying down a little bit of the groundwork of the idea behind the different thoughts.
Yeah, so there are different scholarly opinions on the identity and existence of the beloved disciple. There are scholars, many of them lean conservative, not all, centrist too, who think of the beloved disciple as a perfectly real person who completely wrote the Gospel of John himself. There are scholars who would take a different kind of view and would say there really was a beloved disciple. He existed at one time, but he has become a character in this book written by other people, and his memory has been, in some ways, embellished, perhaps exaggerated, idealized would be the key term. And this is a very common mainstream opinion. There are a number of scholars, also very mainstream scholars, not a majority, but a significant number, that have argued that the beloved disciple might be a purely literary character. He might be invented fictional for one reason or another. These scholars would include Harold Attridge, emeritus from Yale, David Litwa, myself. There are different reasons why scholars would give for this. Some scholars in this camp would suggest that the beloved disciple is playing an important literary role as an eyewitness, guarantor of the authenticity of the text. So the beloved disciple is there to give the gospel an eyewitness flavor and eyewitness authority it doesn't really have or deserve. That this is kind of, if you will, a historiographical trope that you often find sometimes in histories with invented elements where you insert an invented narrator. There are some, like Harold Attridge in particular, who sees this more as a literary device that's serving the purpose of drawing the reader in, of creating literary interest. Some scholars would even throw out the idea that the character is invented as kind of a way for the readers to step into the story and feel themselves as if they can, in the person of the beloved disciple, see what an ideal disciple should do, what an ideal disciple would be, and how they would respond to Jesus.
That's a fascinating. I was just reading some of that. I just needed a little echo from expertise. We could even add probably Robin Faith Walsh to your list, at least her opinion of this book, even though she's not like a specialist in it. I know Dennis MacDonald, who wrote the Dionysian Gospel, would agree with your assessment. And so I really appreciate your time and tacking onto this video here where we are literally dealing with eyewitness stuff and explaining how there were so many eyewitness things going on in various other demigods, heroes, stories, and this is another one. So I really appreciate your time, Dr. Mendez.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It does nothing of the truth of the claim. Nothing to do with the claims that are in this book of Jesus appearing and saying, "Touch me, Thomas," and he's physical and all that. So here is Peregrinus, right? Peregrinus is this guy, Proteus Peregrinus, a philosopher who was a Christian at one point, right there in the 2nd century, early mid-2nd century. There is an Olympic Games taking place. Lucian of Samosata is actually writing about this in his Passing of Peregrinus. Most people don't know this story, and I figure why not? This is the perfect time to help you get aware of it. Peregrinus is going to jump onto a fire in a public audience in front of everyone, committing himself to death, martyrdom, if you will, for his belief in his philosophy. This is not unique. This is in the tradition of what we see with Caesars, but also in the tradition what we see with Heracles and others who died by the flames, if you will, of the god. And you even get this with Asclepius dying by thunderbolt. And there's a debate that Lucian talks about between Asclepius and Heracles of who deserves pedigree. Well, in this, he's on his way home finally after Peregrinus literally kills himself, burns himself alive in front of the audience. And on his way, he says, on my return to the festival, as I returned, I was thinking, here on 38, I was thinking busily, my friend, reflecting what a strange thing love of glory is, how this passion alone is unescapable even by those who are considered wholly admirable. Again, Jesus, he's so humble. He committed himself. If he actually chose death, how do we know he didn't do this for the glory? How do we know that the apostles, if any, actually died for their belief in Christianity? Maybe they died for other reasons. But how do we know that they didn't for glory? Ignatius, in his letter to the Romans, talking about wanting to die. He dies to attain to God. Martyrdom was a glorious act, and you were left in history, etched in history as a saint, guaranteed front row seat in heaven. Come on. Like, this is what Lucian's mocking. He says, let alone that man who in other respects had led a life that was insane and reckless and not undeserving of the fire. Then I encountered many people coming out to see the show themselves, for they expected to find him still alive. You see, on the day before it had been given out that he would greet the rising sun, as in fact they say the Brahmins do, before mounting the pyre, well, I turned back most of them by saying the deed had already been done. Those to whom it was not in itself highly desirable to see the actual spot anyhow and gather up some relic of the fire. So some went anyways to pick up a piece of the charcoal of the fire or whatever, because they probably saw this guy as divine and sacred. He says that much in the rest of the context of this. You really should read it. In that business, I assure you, my friend, I had no end of trouble telling the story to all while they asked questions and sought exact information. Whenever I noticed a man of taste, I would tell him the facts without embellishment, as I have to you. But for the benefit of the dullards, agog to listen, I would thicken the plot a bit on my own account, saying that when the pyre was kindled and Proteus flung himself bodily in, a great earthquake first took place. The Gospels depict an earthquake at the crucifixion of Jesus' death, just so you know. Go check it out for yourself. Accompanied by a bellowing of the ground. And then a vulture flying up out of the midst of the flames went off to heaven, saying in human speech with a loud voice, I am through with the earth, to Olympus I fare. They were wonderstruck and blessed themselves with a shudder and asked me whether the vulture sped eastwards or westwards. I made them whatever reply occurred to me. On my return to the festival, now he just made this up. He made this up to people, tricking people. Earthquake and vulture, and went to Mount Olympus, and the vulture spoke, I am through with earth, to Olympus I fare. People are like, whoa, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Which direction did he head? So on his return to the festival, I came upon a gray-haired man whose face, I assure you, inspired confidence in addition to his beard and his general air of consequence. Like a pastor, like an apologist. They bring confidence. They tell you with confidence, Jesus rose, and we can know this. This is what this old gray-haired dude is doing, right? Telling all about Proteus and how since his cremation, he had beheld him, saw him in white raiment a little while ago, and just now left him walking about cheerfully in the portico of the Seven Voices, wearing a garland of wild olive. Then on top of it all, he put the vulture, swearing that he himself had seen it flying up out of the pyre. When I, Lucian says, when I myself had just previously let it fly to ridicule fools and dullards. So a day later, he's heading back to the festival, and this guy is saying he saw the falcon coming out of the flames to Mount Olympus with his own eyes. Lucian knows this is bullshit because he himself made it up. So how can you trust these ancient texts because people are willing to die? That's absurd. You don't do it for martyrs of Islam. You don't do it for Peregrinus. You don't do it for Ignatius's own martyrdom in the early church. You don't do it for those who died according to the Caesars for their own faith. Brahmins who died leaping on the fire. There were many people willing to die for their beliefs. Many. And they did it for the glory. You aren't persuaded by that. Your indoctrination, I think, is what's playing a significant role as to why this Christian faith and not these other claims.
Written late. For all I know, it could have been written the day after Jesus ascended. The point is that the authorship of the Gospels is a hotly contested issue. What Wes Huff is leaving out is just how absolutely disputed almost everything he's saying is. I also want to mention here something that Wes talks about.
Wes does do that. He does that a lot. He leaves out so much nuance, so much dispute, so many questions and ambiguities, so many possible likely hypotheses and interpretations. He needs this to be what he wants this to be.
About much later, there are dozens of non-canonical gospels that were written but didn't make it into the New Testament for all kinds of different reasons. Listen to what Wes Huff has to say about these gospels.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
Like, what? I'm just going to underline that. He just said of the non-canonical gospels.
Part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
The problem here is with basically the first thing that anybody learns about the New Testament. Scholars think that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke were written later. Why? Because Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark. And not just a little bit. More than 90% of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew's gospel. Mark has 660 verses in total. Over 600 of them are also in Matthew, often copied verbatim. It is undisputed that there is a literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark. And almost everyone agrees that it's Matthew and Luke relying on Mark. I genuinely think I must have just misunderstood Wes here, because if heavily relying on an earlier gospel is reason to suspect it, then this would completely undermine the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. He also says that another problem with these non-canonical Gospels is that some of them appear to have an agenda.
And some of them have an agenda to them.
But one of the most discussed topics in New Testament scholarship is the agendas of the canonical Gospels. Matthew's presentation of Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, Luke's concern for the poor and the marginalized. John's gospel seems to contain polemical material, such as strongly emphasizing that John the Baptist is not the Messiah, probably because there were people around at the time who believed that he was. So when Wes Huff says,
part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
He's just told us that he's got a problem with the New Testament. Okay, moving.
Okay, there's a lot there to unravel. I want to go into an example that I thought was really cool in Luke's gospel, because this is my kind of arena. I love getting into this kind of material. One of the things that I think is very powerful is looking at comparative mythology material, but in Luke's gospel specifically. Bruce Loudon, who's no longer around, writes about theophany and recognition scenes in the Odyssey. I know. Everybody would think, oh, I'm just going to bring up Dennis MacDonald's stuff. Well, Dennis MacDonald clearly is doing mimesis and mimetic criticism, if you will, mimesis criticism with Homer, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Luke and Virgil, the whole nine. But this is another scholar who actually recognizes what's going on in Luke. The author of Luke consciously shapes his narrative to reflect a larger engagement in the contemporary Greco-Roman world. The Lucan author maps Jesus onto additional cultural nodes of larger Greco-Roman culture to make it easier for his audience to follow. So Bonds asserts overlap with epic poetry in particular. Luke's narrative has incorporated with evident skill a number of stylistic and dramatic devices characteristic of Greco-Roman epic in general. These are quotes. Early Christian writings demonstrate that Christians themselves saw parallels between their own sacred narratives and Greek myths. Acts 17. Paul's appearance in Athens is premised upon such resemblances. Accordingly, I argue that Luke 24:13-53 in its larger contours is in dialogue with several episodes from the Odyssey. This is powerful. So, okay, the tradition as to post-mortem appearances seems to have been exceptionally fluid. The earliest such account, for instance, is Paul, 1 Corinthians 13:5-8. Yeah. Features elements no longer present in any other gospel's later treatment. Luke is further distinct. So he goes on into theophany, the genre of myth that features an unrecognized immortal taking the form of a stranger to test a host's hospitality. Therefore, morality and piety naturally falls into two subtypes. In negative theophany, guests misbehave and provoke a god's wrath and apocalyptic destruction. Odyssey 1, Odyssey 17 through 22, Genesis 19. So there you have Sodom and Gomorrah, where the people treat the divine ones that are in disguise not right. You also have this in Philemon and Bacchus. So Philemon and Bacchus here is another story in Ovid's Metamorphosis. And in this story, Jupiter, he shows up, I think, with Hermes, but he goes and travels as weary travelers over the land. They wandered begging for their food and bed. And of 1,000 homes, all the doors were bolted and no words of kindness given. So wicked were the people of that land, at last, by chance, they stopped at a small house whose humble roof was thatched with reeds and straw. And here a kind of old couple greeted them. So they went to 1,000 homes. 1,000 homes refused them and did not offer them food, warmth, anything like that. The good dame Bacchus seemed about the age of old Philemon, her devoted man. They had been married in their early youth and in some cottage and had lived in it and grown together to a good old age. So they go on and actually find out that when the two gods, Jove, Jupiter, Zeus, and Mercury, had reached this cottage and with bending necks had entered the low door, the old man bade them rest their wearied limbs and set a bench on which his good wife Bacchus threw a cloth. And then with kindly bustles, she stirred up the glowing embers on the hearth and then laid tender leaves and bark and bending down, breathed onto them with her ancient breath until they kindled into flame. So, but while they served, the wine bowl often drained and as often was replenished. So the wine starts to fill and the husband recognizes, oh my gosh, these must be gods. Go and get the goose, right? Sacrifice. Let's sacrifice to the gods. But swift of wing, at last it wearied them and fled for refuge to the smiling gods. At once the deities forbade their zeal and said, a righteous punishment shall fall severe upon the wicked neighborhood. These bad people who didn't give us hospitality, but you did. Well, when you go to Luke 24, that's exactly what on the road to Emmaus happens. They show good hospitality, not even realizing this is a theophany. It's a hospitality myth where they're actually entertaining this Jesus right there. They don't even realize it's Jesus right there. So Luke 24 makes central use of both positive theophany and postponed recognition. As Cleopas and another unnamed disciple now walk toward Emmaus, the resurrected Jesus joins them in mid-conversation. Unrecognized, he asks what they are discussing. When Cleopas answers that the stranger must be the only one in Jerusalem who does not know the events of the last few days, we quickly recognize the dynamics of the Odyssey episodes we have just discussed above, which he goes over those examples. So who is this Cleopas? Attempts to find the historical basis for this character are misguided, I suggest. Instead, we might consider the clues in his name provides. Basically, misunderstanding of even this has hindered recognition of his larger narrative function. Cleopas is a truncated version of Cleopatras, a common Greek name. It occurs as early as the Iliad, with the components reversed for Achilles' boon companion, Patroclus, Kleos. A key word in Homeric epic can mean fame, glory, or report, added to the common term for father. Compound names of this sort are often possessive, making it likely meaning the father's glory. The particular meaning I propose here, as is typical of many characters in myth, Cleopas is a speaking name with other characters aware of its meaning and assuming that the audience is as well. Kleos is probably already an archaic word, deliberate archaisms often being characteristics of mythical narratives. In the Greek of the New Testament occurring only at 1 Peter 2:20, which may support the view that its author is not the disciple, but a well-educated Hellenist. Jesus himself will shortly use New Testament's preferred term for glory, doxa, as we will discuss below. So he goes on to talk about the divine guest correcting the naive host, occurring with the positive theophany in Genesis 18 with Lot, not Lot, Abraham and Sarah, where the three divine figures appear. They offer them food and hospitality. They do things right, which meant they get blessed, right? They don't get cursed. They don't get destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. These are mythologies. These are tropes. If you don't know these tropes, then when you read this stuff and you think this one happened, but all the others didn't, you're committing special pleading fallacy. Honestly, you just don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're reading.
After mentioning the Gospels, Wes goes on to talk about Paul. Whenever the Gospels were written, and by whomever, we know that Paul is the earliest source of the New Testament, dating squarely from the middle of the 1st century. And we think that he actually did write at least 7 of the letters attributed to him. And so it's to him that we now turn.
So, how do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything about this extraordinary event. And also, even if Jesus did appear to 500 people, how many of them actually believed what they saw? Again, we're not told. Maybe there was an appearance, but only some of them believed it.
Yeah, this is, again, going to get into the area that I wrote an article on academia.edu where you can go and read about the doubting tradition, the minimal doubts argument. There's a growing thread of doubt that you find in the gospel narratives may actually stem already from the doubting of the Corinthians, right? And people who are not sure, and he's having to give them some kind of clarity or have them be persuaded or whatnot. Mark clearly has a scandalous ending. Matthew has doubters that are worshiping Jesus on a mountain in Galilee, kind of fulfilling Mark's ending, but adding that some doubted. Luke continues the doubting tradition and literally ends up with John having the ultimate doubting story with Thomas, fulfilling those doubts, which we already were looking at some of the doubting traditions of Asclepius earlier. And my point is it grows and grows and grows until the point where it's Jesus breaks the fourth wall in John's gospel. And he's like, look, touch me, feel me, Thomas. That's your peers. Now you know. You believe because you see, but blessed, it's almost like he turns and looks at you and goes, oh, blessed are those who don't see and yet still believe. Oh, okay. It's like he's talking to the reader at that point, the believer at that point. So let's see what else Alex has to bring.
Remember, Matthew's gospel tells us that even when Jesus appeared right in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted. They'd lived with Jesus and he was standing right in front of them, but they didn't believe. Many people ask me, why would the disciples have believed in the risen Christ if they didn't actually see him? In response,
if you grant these literally are stories what literally happened, we're going to have problems at the end of the day. But if you want to say this is a memory and somewhere on this hill at one point, they end up having visionary experiences and some of them doubted and some of them believed during that, sure, that's fine. It's also possible this is a trope as well. And it's to get the doubter to not doubt. This growing tradition of doubt is to try and persuade you, the doubter, to not doubt. Believe. Trust me, dude. Blessed are those who don't see and yet believe.
I point to this verse in Matthew and ask the reverse. How could the disciples have seen him and then not believed? With the 500...
This is a great question. If there is a literal, bodily, physically resurrected Jesus right in front of them, why would they doubt? What kind of thing is happening on that mountain? Scholars like James Tabor and others I've spoken to think that there might be this idea that the transfiguration scene where this light on a hill with the three main disciples, right? That they have this vision that Jesus tells them, don't tell anyone what you saw, with Elijah and Moses on the side and Jesus in the center. That this is like prefiguring what was supposed to happen after the resurrection, of a vision that they would see the deified Jesus, right? And if that's the case, then this echoes what Alex is trying to say about visionary experiences and what is going to be echoed with other miracle cases.
How many of them believed that they saw Jesus? If some of the disciples doubted that it was him, why would we trust an unnamed mass of strangers mentioned briefly in one source by a man who wasn't there but heard that they'd seen him? And even if all of the 500 people did believe that it was Jesus, how would Paul know this? Even if he was there, which he wasn't, did he interview them? Was there a show of hands for anyone who doubted before the crowd dispersed? There was no easy way even for Paul to know what these people believed, which makes it impossible for us to know what they believed. And even if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary, or the Roman Emperor Constantine's vision of a cross of light in the sky, which may have been seen by his whole army as well. The source isn't clear. Look at this image. This is a picture of a crowd in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This crowd, many more than 500 in number, were witness to the so-called miracle of the sun. A prophecy by 3 shepherd children said that the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle on the 13th of October, causing this large crowd to gather on that day. And the miracle happened. Testimonies from the members in the crowd were published in the newspaper. They claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky, zigzagging around, and even advancing towards the earth, all for 10 minutes. So a large crowd witnessing a prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it and precisely what they saw. We even have their direct testimony. Does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not? But Alex, how do you explain this then? If it didn't actually happen, why would there even be this rumor of 500 people seeing Jesus? Well, I'm glad you asked. I want to share an idea that I learned from the Christian biblical scholar Dale Allison in his glorious book on the resurrection of Jesus. Think about this for a moment. How could, quote, more than 500 people all see the man Jesus, quote, at one time? That's a pretty large group of people. How closely could they have examined him? How could they all have got a good view at one time? Imagine a celebrity like Justin Bieber being surrounded by 500 people in the street. How well would you be able to make him out? Could you even be certain that it was him? Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's take a look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
So he's about to get down into the Greek here, which is really an interesting observation. But again, if you take those words at one time, 500 witnesses, which Wes was wrong about saying 400 off the top of his mind, how can they all see him at one time, right? If that is the best way to understand it. And it seems like it could be. Well, you could see him in the sky. Paul claims to have met a guy who went to the third heaven. Like, visions and these kinds of things seem to be part and parcel of cultic settings. And we have contemporaneous examples. We have ancient examples. My point is, if we're going to grant this, why don't we also see the Caesar, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, several other sources talk about them ascending to heaven, and eyewitnesses actually see them ascend to heaven. The question is, they're probably feigning some of this stuff. But in some cases, you wonder, are they having a natural phenomena that they're attributing to it? There's so many questions. And I've been talking to Richard C. Miller back and forth about this with his book on these translation fables and eyewitness stuff that comes up. Romulus with Julius Proculus literally comes forward saying he saw Romulus in the sky ascending out of the heavens, and he's speaking to him. So the question is it invented? Or is it like Fatima, where you're going to see some type of sun in the sky? Or is there a mixture of both going on between purposeful myth making and legend building, inventing these stories, and superstitious activity happening? This is where I'm at, wrestling between those two ideas.
but in the original Greek in which Paul was writing. Here's Paul talking about the appearances. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to the 500. But notice that in between the words appeared and 500, we have this word, excuse my pronunciation, epano. This word is typically translated here as more than. Hence, Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers. But let's investigate this word epano. Every other time it appears in the New Testament, it's translated differently. The word epano means not more than, but over or above or upon. The only place in the whole New Testament where this word is translated to mean more than is, you guessed it, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That's why, by the way, interestingly, if you look at the King James version of this verse, you'll read the following. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. Above. It's interesting, right? So looking at the Greek, it seems plausible that Jesus did not appear to more than 500 people, but rather he appeared above 500 people. Yes, above. Do you see what I'm getting at? It was a vision in the sky, just like the sun miracle above Fatima or the cross of light above Constantine's army. It happened above the crowd. Now, of course, that word, epano, does appear here before a number, 500. So it could well mean over or above 500, as in more than 500. But then again, in Luke chapter 19, during the parable of the 10 minas, Jesus has a man say to one of his servants, take charge of 10 cities, and to his other servant, you take charge of 5 cities. If you read the English Standard Version, the translation is, you shall have authority over 10 cities, or you are to be over 5 cities. Why? Well, because the word there is, you guessed it, epano, over. So even in front of a number, this can still mean over rather than more than. And even without this linguistic evidence, what do you think is the most likely explanation for a group of 500 people all seeing Jesus at one time, especially considering Paul's own conversion on the road to Damascus? Christians say that this involved him meeting the risen Christ, but Acts tells us that he simply saw a flash of light and heard a voice. That was it. That was the nature of Paul's meeting with Jesus, a flash of light. Was the appearance to the 500 of a similar form? We simply do not know. Whatever we believe about this strange verse, it's hardly evidence enough to balance the resurrection upon. Here are the words of Dale Allison on this appearance to the 500 in.
He goes on to explain Dale Allison's position on this. I'd like to cover a little bit about some of these road experiences or even quotes that I think are really worthy of bringing up, for you to kind of see some of the evidence about Roman road experiences and other stuff that was going on in the Roman imperial cult, which was the predominant cult that would have had serious power in the Roman Empire at this time. Eustathius of Thessalonica, commentary on the Iliad. In this passage, Eustathius recounts an episode involving Alexander the Great, as reported by his court historian Callisthenes. According to the narrative, Alexander commanded the sea to recede, and it obeyed, allowing his army to pass, a testament in his perceived divine favor and authority. Also, Augustus was said to have controlled the weather. In Roman tradition, witnessing miraculous events associated with the death of an emperor, particularly their ascension to the heavens, was quite common. One notable account comes from the historian Cassius Dio, who provides a vivid description of such a miracle and even names the witness. Now, these rumors began to be current at a later date. At the time, they declared Augustus immortal, assigned to him priests and sacred rites, and made Livia, who was also called Julia and Augusta, his priestess. They also permitted her to employ a lictor when she exercised her sacred office. On her part, she bestowed 1,000,000 sesterces upon a certain Numerius Atticus, a senator and ex-praetor, because he swore that he had seen Augustus ascending to heaven, after the manner of which tradition tells concerning Proculus and Romulus. So there's already a tradition he's mentioning, and here's another Caesar that's being seen ascending to heaven, like the book of Acts has Jesus. Now remember, the book of Acts also has a Roman road, or a road experience, the road to Damascus with Paul and his conversion. So Cassius Dio spills the tea about a senator who saw Drusilla taking a celestial elevator up to heaven by ascending in Roman history 59:11. Seneca backs this up, adding a bit of flair by mentioning a guy who witnessed both Drusilla and Claudius floating upward or skyward. So Apologetics 1.2. Then there's Aurelius Victor, who narrates an event that eerily echoes the zombie-like resurrection of the saints described in Matthew 27:52. Check this out. On the other hand, the senators were not swayed by the entreaties of the emperor to accord him, Hadrian, the honor of deification. So deeply did they mourn the loss of so many men of their order. However, after those whose death they were grieving suddenly appeared, and each one embraced his relatives and friends, they sanctioned what they had refused. They appeared. Those that were dead appeared, just like Matthew. So just like the divine happenings around Jesus, the Greco-Roman tradition also had some pretty spectacular events. Let's read Romulus, son of Mars, for a second here. The fable is this. The legendary founding king of Rome, while mustering troops on Campus Martius, was caught up to heaven when clouds suddenly descended and enveloped him. When the clouds had departed, he was seen no more. In the fearsome spectacle, most of his troops fled, but the remaining nobles instructed the people that Romulus had been translated to the gods. An alternate account arose that perhaps the nobles had slain the king and invented the tale to cover up their treachery. Later, however, Julius Proculus stepped forward to testify before all the people that he had been eyewitness to the translated Romulus, having met him traveling on the Via Appia. Romulus, according to this tale, offered his nation a final great commission and again vanished. And there's the missing body trope again. By the way, this is documented in Richard C. Miller, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, in his book. Again, Christians knew about these eyewitnesses and they had some strong feelings about them. Tertullian, a Christian writer, didn't hold back his disdain when he wrote, "Where shall I rejoice? Where shall I exult? Watching so many kings who are reported to have been received in heaven, along with Jupiter himself and the witnesses themselves who groan together in the depths of hell." So Tertullian knew it. Really interesting. Seneca, the younger, satirical work. Who has ever demanded eyewitnesses from a historian? If there were, nevertheless, a necessity to produce a witness, then ask the man who saw Drusilla going into heaven. The same fellow will say that he had seen Claudius traveling on the road with crippled legs. Whether he wants to or not, it is necessary for him to see everything that is translated into heaven. He is the watchman of the Appian Way, along which you know that divine Augustus and Tiberius Caesar went unto the gods. And of course, there's so much here. We went over Peregrinus. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that there's just too much material that we will never be able to get into of eyewitnesses, resurrected heroes, divine births, miracles that happened with people doing similar types of things that Jesus did, competing cults with different heroes. You just chose yours. And I'd love to get the opportunity to talk to someone like Rogan and to go into more of these accounts, discussing how common these legends, fables, tropes, myths were, and how the New Testament literally uses the same conventions, tropes, themes, narrative structures, theoxany, delayed recognition, feigned or not feigned, but translations that we see with Richard C. Miller. Now, if the world knew about this, I think they'd enjoy history in the ancient world a lot more, like I've come to do. But instead, they're getting the typical apologetic baggage. And I want the scholarly, critical, let's like all cards on the table, have fun with this material. Thank you, Alex O'Connor, for making such a cool video, responding very succinct, very precise, very, very particular about the way that you approached it. I'm hoping that I added some stuff, if you stuck this far, that was educational and it helped people to understand a much more broadened perspective of the ancient world with miracles, with all sorts of stories. There's so much more I just don't have the time or energy to get into. Please subscribe to the channel, join our Patreon. Look, I'm wanting to start joining my Discord. We have a MythVision Discord. I'll put that in the description. I hope you'll join. Let's have a conversation. I'm not interested in any nonsense there, but you can also support our work. So hope you see you there, and I hope you'll support what MythVision's doing. Again, thank you.